Mouthwashing starts by making you pilot a spaceship straight into an asteroid. You barely know where you are before the telepar is already doomed. The game doesn't give you any time to settle in first. It shows you the disaster before you've had any chance to understand what caused it. Then, it takes you backwards. The telepar is suddenly whole again, and what was a doomed ship starts to feel like a place where people lived. The artificial sunset in the main room gives the ship an almost comforting atmosphere, which feels strange because you've already seen what this place eventually becomes. That contrast is the foundation of how mouthwashing can do so much with so little. Mouthwashing doesn't tell its story in order. It keeps moving between different points in the timeline, which means you never experience the telepar's one environment slowly falling apart. You see it ruined, then you're allowed to remember what it looked like before. Later, you return to the wreck with a completely different understanding of what was lost. The ship hasn't become larger physically, but it takes up more space on a timeline, and that's how mouthwashing got so much out of such a small game. There may only be a few rooms and 5 major characters, yet the game rarely feels like it's running out of material. It doesn't depend on constant novelty. Instead, it keeps finding ways to make familiar things feel different. You end up learning the telepar pretty quickly. After enough time aboard the ship, moving through it becomes almost automatic. That should be dangerous for a horror game because familiarity usually kills uncertainty. Once you know exactly where a hallway leads, walking through it becomes routine. Mouthwashing uses that familiarity against you. When you first explore the ship after the crash, you don't have much reason to care about what any particular room used to be. It's just part of the wreck. Then the story takes you back to a time where that same place was still being used normally. Now when you return to the damaged version, you remember it. That's much more effective than simply replacing the room with somewhere new because a new environment has no history with the player. Mouthwashing can make a familiar place uncomfortable just by changing when you're seeing it. The artificial sunset in the main room is probably the clearest example. Before the crash, it makes the main living area feel almost warm. It's obviously fake, but that makes it almost more human. Someone decided that the crew needed something that resembled a real horizon to keep them all sane. But after everything goes wrong, that same place feels completely different. Mouthwashing doesn't need to explain the contrast. You can remember how it felt before. That's what makes the telepar feel bigger than it really is. You're not discovering more physical space as the game continues. You're building a relationship with the space that's already there. But all of this only works because the people aboard the telepar are interesting enough to make those memories matter. Mouthwashing has a tiny cast, but it lets you understand them gradually. You spend enough time around Swansea that his bitterness stops feeling like his entire personality. Daisuke initially comes across as painfully optimistic, but that starts to mean more once you understand the situation he's trapped in. Anya's discomfort is noticeable long before the game gives you enough context to understand where it's coming from. Then there's Jimmy, whose need to control the situation becomes increasingly important as the story progresses. But Curly is probably the best example of what the game is doing with its characters, because your understanding of him changes almost completely. Before you even played Mouthwashing, there's a decent chance you've already seen him. He's the face most associated with the game. His post-crash body is horrifying, and when you actually find him aboard the telepar, he's lying there not even able to communicate. The game knows exactly what that image does to you. Curly looks like the monster. At that point, you don't understand the crash or the people involved in it, but you do know that Curly was in charge of piloting the ship, so it's natural to assume that this disturbing figure must be somehow connected to what went wrong. But then Mouthwashing takes you backwards in time and lets you actually meet him, and the image you started with becomes harder and harder to reconcile with the person that you're seeing. That's where Curly becomes much more important than just being a shocking character design. As you learn more about him, his appearance stops suggesting that he's dangerous and starts showing you how much he's suffered. That changes the question the game is asking. The person that looks most horrifying isn't necessarily the person you should be afraid of. Mouthwashing spends a lot of its story playing with that disconnect. Actual cruelty doesn't always announce itself. It can come from someone who still thinks of themselves as reasonable. Someone can cause enormous damage and still construct an explanation where they were only trying to make things better. That's so much closer to what the story is really about. Something deeply wrong happens before the telepar even reaches the asteroid, and the rest of the game lives in the consequences of how people respond to it. The important part isn't just the original act itself, it's what happens when somebody would rather reshape reality around themselves than admit what they've done. That idea runs throughout the whole game. Responsibility becomes something characters either accept or avoid, and Mouthwashing is especially interested in what avoidance starts doing to everybody else. That's also why Curly becomes such an interesting reversal. He begins as this horrifying image that seems almost designed to make you suspicious of him, but by the time you understand more of the story, he's one of the few characters who inspires genuine sympathy. The game hasn't changed his model, it's changed what his model means, and Mouthwashing does that constantly. This is why the nonlinear structure isn't just there to make the plot confusing or mysterious. It's what allows the game to keep reusing the same material without ever making it feel repetitive. You can hear a conversation early on and barely think about it because you don't understand what sits underneath it. Much later, one new piece of context can make you remember that scene completely differently. Nothing about the original conversation needs to change. What the player knows changed. That lets mouthwashing turn information into a kind of content of its own. Most games need to keep you moving forward to maintain your attention. They take you somewhere new because you've already exhausted the old location.
Hello, Peter. Welcome to Fortnite.
Mouthwashing can move backward and still give you something new because you're returning with knowledge that you didn't have before. That's what makes the characters feel more complicated than their screen time would ever suggest. You aren't simply learning more facts about them, you're repeatedly being forced to reconsider the version of them that you already built into your head. Curly is threatening until he isn't. Swansea seems easy to dismiss until you understand him better. Jimmy's behavior means one thing when you first see it and something very different as more of the story comes into focus. The game gets an enormous amount of mileage out of changing interpretation rather than constantly creating new material. This focus on story also means mechanics don't have to carry the whole experience. Mouthwashing is mechanically simple for most of its runtime, but I don't think that hurts it because the game usually has a very good reason for asking you to interact with something. The sequences involving Curly are a good example. What you're physically doing isn't complicated enough to be some deep gameplay system, and making it more complex probably wouldn't improve the scene anyway. The discomfort comes from the fact that you're the one being made to do it. That's enough. This is where mouthwashing feels especially useful as an example for smaller developers. When a game feels thin, the instinct is often to add another mechanic, because mechanics are easy to point at as proof that the player has more to do. But another system only helps if it actually adds something to the experience. Mouthwashing is willing to leave an interaction extremely simple when the context is already doing the important work. The player doesn't need 10 different ways to interact with Curly. The game just needs you to understand what it means when you're forced to interact with him at all. The visuals follow that same idea. Mouthwashing clearly isn't trying to look like a massive budget game, and it would probably lose something if it did. Its roughness gives the whole experience a particular identity, especially when the story starts becoming more surreal. Curly's design again shows how much developers can get from one strong idea. At first, his appearance creates suspicion, later that exact same image becomes tragic when you finally understand the person underneath it. That's a much better use of a character design than simply making something disturbing because this is a horror game and people are expecting disturbing things. His appearance is an integral part of the storytelling. The same thing happens with the Tulpar itself. The ship doesn't need hundreds of unique rooms because the few spaces you do see become attached to the particular moments of the story. By the end, you're not looking at generic sci-fi hallways anymore, you're remembering what happened there. That's ultimately why mouthwashing feels so much bigger than it actually is. It doesn't try to disguise its limitations. You know the ship is tiny because you've walked through it enough times to memorize it. You know the cast is small because you spent most of the game trapped with the same people. But those limitations make the story more focused. Because there aren't dozens of characters competing for attention, your understanding of someone like Curly has enough time to completely reverse. Because you keep returning to the same parts of the Tulpar, those locations have enough time to build history. And because the story refuses to move in a straight line, the game can keep showing you familiar things while changing what you think about them. That's how mouthwashing does so much with so little. The game itself doesn't need to keep getting bigger, just your understanding of it.